The rain drummed against the funeral home windows as I sat alone in the back row, watching my family gather around Grandma Rose's casket. They huddled together like a protective circle, whispering among themselves while casting occasional glances in my direction. I'd driven 4 hours from the city to be here, but the distance between us felt much greater than miles. Grandma Rose had been the only one who truly understood me. While my cousins pursued traditional careers and settled down in our small farming town, I'd chosen a different path. I became a freelance photographer, traveling for work, living in a tiny apartment instead of the sprawling farmhouses my family preferred. They saw it as rejection of our roots. Grandma saw it as courage. After the service, my Uncle Frank approached me with that familiar look of barely concealed disapproval. His wife Martha stood beside him, clutching her purse like a shield. "Sarah, we need to talk about the will," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd assumed since becoming the family patriarch. My stomach dropped. I'd been dreading this conversation, but I hadn't expected it to happen so soon after laying Grandma to rest. "She left the farm to Frank and me," my Aunt Linda chimed in, appearing at his shoulder. "The house goes to Martha and Frank. The antiques are being divided among the grandchildren who stayed local." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What about me?" Frank's expression softened slightly, but his words cut deep. "I'm sorry, Sarah. She didn't mention you in the will. Maybe she thought since you'd moved away." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I'd abandoned the family, so the family had abandoned me. Even in death, it seemed, I remained the outsider. I drove back to the city in a daze. Grandma's funeral program crumpled on my passenger seat. The 4-hour journey felt endless, filled with memories of summer afternoons spent in her kitchen, learning to can peaches and listening to stories about our family's history. How could she have left me nothing? My apartment felt smaller than usual when I returned. The walls seemed to close in as I replayed the conversation with my uncle. I'd always known I was different from the rest of my family, but I'd believed Grandma understood my choices. She'd encouraged my photography, even posing for portraits when I was first learning to use my camera. I pulled out my laptop and searched for the local newspaper's obituary section. There it was. Rose Margaret Thompson, beloved matriarch of the Thompson farming family, passed away peacefully at age 89. The article mentioned her surviving children and grandchildren, listing their accomplishments and connections to the community. My name appeared only in passing, identified simply as granddaughter Sarah of the city. Even in death, I was defined by my absence rather than my presence. The next few weeks blurred together. I threw myself into work, accepting every photography assignment that came my way. Weddings, corporate events, family portraits, anything to keep my mind occupied. But late at night, when the camera was put away and the editing was done, the hurt crept back in. I'd lost more than my grandmother. I'd lost my connection to a family history that stretched back 4 generations on that farm. The old farmhouse where my great-great-grandfather had first settled, the barn where my grandfather had taught me to milk cows, the garden where Grandma and I had planted sunflowers every spring. None of it would be mine to remember or preserve. 3 months after the funeral, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. I groggily answered to find Martha's voice on the other end, unusually strained. "Sarah, I know this is awkward, but we need your help," she began without preamble. "We're cleaning out the farmhouse to put it on the market, and there's just too much stuff. Frank's back is acting up, and Linda's kids are too busy with their own lives." I sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "You're selling the house? The farm's too much work for Frank, and none of the local grandkids want to take it on. We figured it's better to sell while the market's good." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dismantling 4 generations of family history. My heart clenched. "What about all of Grandma's things?" "That's why we're calling. We've taken what we want, but there's still rooms full of her stuff. Old clothes, books, kitchen gadgets from the 50s. Most of it's probably junk, but we thought maybe you'd want to look through it before we donate everything to charity." The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had excluded me from the will now wanted my help cleaning up the mess they'd inherited. But the chance to spend time in Grandma's house one last time, to say a proper goodbye, was too precious to refuse. "When do you need me there?" I asked. "This weekend would be perfect. You can stay in your old room upstairs." just like when you were little. Except nothing was like when I was little. Grandma wouldn't be there to greet me with fresh cookies and stories. The house would be empty, stripped of the warmth that had made it home. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered as I pulled into the gravel driveway. The white paint was peeling, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of years. Grandma's flower boxes sat empty, the soil dried and cracked. It was like seeing a beloved friend after a long illness, recognizable but diminished. Martha met me at the front door, her smile tight with the awkwardness of our situation. "Thanks for coming, Sarah. I know this isn't easy." Inside, the house felt hollow. Boxes were stacked in the living room, labeled with my cousins' names. The walls bore rectangular patches of unfaded paint where family photos had hung for decades. Even the familiar smell of lavender and vanilla that had always permeated the house was fading, replaced by the sterile scent of packing tape and cardboard. "We've cleared out most of the main rooms," Martha explained, leading me through the space. "But the sewing room upstairs is untouched. Grandma spent so much time up there, and honestly, none of us knew what to do with all those crafting supplies." My heart lifted slightly. The sewing room had been Grandma's sanctuary, where she'd taught me to embroider and quilt during long summer visits. If any part of the house still held her essence, it would be there. "Take whatever you want from up there," Martha continued. "The sewing machine is probably worth something, but the rest is just fabric scraps and old patterns." I nodded, not trusting my voice. To Martha, it was just crafting supplies. To me, it was the repository of countless afternoons spent learning at Grandma's side, her patient hands guiding mine as we worked on projects that seemed impossibly complex to my young fingers. I climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The sewing room door stood slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with trembling fingers. Unlike the rest of the house, this room remained exactly as Grandma had left it. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Her ancient Singer sewing machine sat on the wooden table by the window, a half-finished quilt still stretched beneath the presser foot. Spools of thread in every color imaginable lined the shelves, and fabric remnants overflowed from wicker baskets scattered around the room. I ran my fingers along the quilt's edge, recognizing the pattern. It was a wedding ring design, the same one she'd made for each of her grandchildren when they married, all except me. I'd never married, never given her the chance to create this symbol of love and continuity for my future. The room smelled like her, that comforting blend of fabric softener and the rose water she dabbed behind her ears every morning. I sank into the old rocking chair where she used to sit while hand-stitching, and for a moment I could almost hear her humming the old hymns she'd loved. Boxes of patterns were stacked against one wall, their edges worn from decades of use. I opened one at random and found tissue paper templates for children's clothes, each piece carefully labeled in her spidery handwriting. Another box held Christmas decorations she'd sewn, felt stockings with our names embroidered in gold thread, fabric angels with delicate lace wings. Every item told a story of love expressed through needle and thread. This wasn't just a sewing room. It was a museum of devotion, a testament to the way Grandma had woven her family together with patient, careful stitches. I spent hours in the sewing room, carefully sorting through Grandma's treasures. Each discovery felt like receiving a small gift from beyond the grave. I found the first sampler I'd ever embroidered, my crooked stitches preserved between sheets of tissue paper. There was the apron she'd worn every Thanksgiving, stained with decades of turkey drippings and love. In the corner sat an ornate wooden sewing box I'd never noticed before. It was clearly old, with intricate carved flowers decorating its lid and brass hinges that had tarnished with age. Unlike everything else in the room, it seemed deliberately placed, positioned where the afternoon light would catch its polished surface. I lifted the heavy lid, expecting to find more spools of thread or perhaps her good embroidery scissors. Instead, the box was divided into small compartments, each lined with faded blue velvet. Most were empty, but one held a collection of antique thimbles, and another contained buttons that looked like they'd come from Victorian-era dresses. As I explored each compartment, my fingers found something unexpected. a small lever hidden beneath the velvet lining of the largest section. When I pressed it, I heard a soft click, and a secret compartment opened at the bottom of the box. My breath caught. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and addressed in Grandma's familiar handwriting. For my dear Sarah, when the time is right. My hands shook as I lifted the envelope. It was heavier than expected, as if it contained more than just a letter. The seal was intact, the wax bearing the impression of an old signet ring I remembered Grandma wearing on special occasions. Whatever was inside had been waiting for me, hidden away like a secret treasure. The family had been wrong. Grandma hadn't forgotten me after all. I carried the envelope downstairs to the kitchen, needing the familiar comfort of Grandma's old wooden table to open what felt like a message from beyond. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the wax seal, trying not to damage what might be my last communication from her. The envelope contained several items: a handwritten letter on her good stationery, a small brass key, and what appeared to be legal documents. I unfolded the letter first, my eyes immediately filling with tears at the sight of her careful cursive. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I pray you found this letter in my sewing box as I intended. I know the family believes I left you nothing in my will, and I allowed them to think so for reasons that will become clear." I had to stop reading to wipe my eyes. She had known. Somehow she'd known exactly what would happen. "You were always different from the others, my dear girl. Where they saw roots as chains, you saw the world as possibility. Where they found comfort in tradition, you found courage in change. I loved them all, but I understood you in a way that perhaps only another dreamer could." The letter continued, explaining that the official will had been deliberately incomplete. She'd worked with a lawyer in the city, someone the family didn't know, to create a separate document that would ensure I received what she truly wanted me to have. "The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 247. Inside, you'll find the deed to the old cottage on the back 40 acres, the one where your great-grandmother lived. It's yours now, along with everything needed to restore it." I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. The cottage. I remembered it from childhood visits, a small stone house nestled in a grove of oak trees at the far edge of the property. It had been abandoned for decades, but Grandma used to take me there for picnics, telling me stories about my great-grandmother who'd lived there as a young bride. "I know the cottage needs work," the letter continued, "but I also know you have the vision to see what it could become. The safety deposit box contains enough money to restore it properly, along with some other surprises I think you'll appreciate." My vision blurred again as I read her explanation. She'd been planning this for years, quietly setting aside money and working with her lawyer to ensure the cottage would pass to me without the family's knowledge. The official will had divided the main property among her children, but the cottage and its surrounding 5 acres had been legally separated years earlier. "I wanted you to have a place to come home to, Sarah. Not the big farmhouse with all its expectations and memories of conformity, but a place that could be truly yours. A place where you can create new traditions while honoring the old ones." The letter went on to explain that she'd also included my grandfather's old photography equipment in the safety deposit box. Cameras and lenses from the 1950s that he'd used to document farm life. She'd saved every photograph I'd ever sent her, and she wanted me to continue the family tradition of capturing moments, just in my own way. "You are not the black sheep, my darling. You are the one who will carry our story forward in ways the others cannot imagine." I sat in the kitchen for a long time, holding the letter and trying to process everything I'd learned. The cottage was mine. Not only had Grandma not forgotten me, but she'd given me something far more precious than money or antiques. She'd given me a place where I belonged. Eventually, I heard Martha's car in the driveway. She came through the back door carrying grocery bags, clearly planning to stay for dinner while we continued sorting through Grandma's belongings. "Find anything interesting up there?" she asked, setting the bags on the counter. I held up the letter, watching her expression change as she recognized Grandma's handwriting. "Actually, yes. I found this in her sewing box." Martha's face went pale as I explained what the letter contained. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "That's impossible. she finally managed. "Frank handled all the legal paperwork. There was no mention of any cottage or separate property. Because it was handled by a different lawyer," I explained gently. "Grandma planned this carefully. She wanted to make sure I had something that was truly mine." Martha's expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like relief. "So you're not completely left out after all?" "No," I said, folding the letter carefully. "I'm not." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of family dynamics and misunderstandings hanging between us. Finally, Martha spoke again. "She always said you were special, you know, different from the rest of us. Frank used to get annoyed when she'd go on about your photography and your adventures in the city." For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was having a real conversation with a family member. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with the brass key clutched in my sweaty palm. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, had known Grandma for decades and greeted me with genuine warmth when I explained why I was there. "Rose mentioned you might be coming by," she said, leading me to the vault. "She was very specific about the instructions for this box. Said you'd know when the time was right." The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected. Inside, I found a thick manila envelope containing the deed to the cottage and surrounding property, just as Grandma had promised. But there was so much more. Bundles of cash, carefully counted and wrapped, totaled more than enough to restore the cottage completely. There were also savings bonds in my name, purchased over the years with small amounts that must have been scraped together from her modest pension. But the most precious discovery was a collection of my grandfather's photography equipment, carefully preserved in custom-fitted cases. His old Leica camera, several vintage lenses, and a light meter that still worked perfectly. Wrapped in tissue paper was a note in Grandma's handwriting. "He would have wanted you to have these. You have his eye for capturing the soul of a moment." At the bottom of the box was a photo album I'd never seen before. It contained every single photograph I'd ever sent Grandma, carefully mounted and labeled with dates and locations. Pictures from my travels, portraits I'd taken of strangers in coffee shops, landscapes that had moved me to capture them. She'd treasured them all. The final page held a photo of the cottage from decades earlier, when it was still inhabited and surrounded by a thriving garden. A note was attached. "Your canvas awaits, my dear artist." Armed with the deed and a renewed sense of purpose, I drove to the cottage the next afternoon. The dirt road that led to it was overgrown with weeds, and branches scraped against my car windows as I navigated the winding path through the oak grove. When the cottage came into view, my heart both soared and sank. The stone walls were solid, built to last by craftsmen who understood their trade, but the roof sagged in places, and ivy had claimed most of the exterior walls. Windows were boarded up, and the front porch had partially collapsed. Yet even in its dilapidated state, I could see the cottage's potential. It sat in a natural clearing surrounded by mature trees that would provide perfect shade in summer and allow winter sunlight to warm the windows. A creek ran nearby, its gentle babbling audible even from the overgrown front yard. I found the key hidden exactly where Grandma's letter said it would be, under the third stone from the left, in what had once been a garden wall. The front door opened with a protest of rusty hinges, revealing a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the boarded windows, and the air smelled of old wood and memories. But underneath the neglect, I could sense the love that had once filled this space. The wide plank floors were solid beneath my feet, and the hand-hewn beams overhead spoke of craftsmanship that would last another century. This wasn't just a building. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to create something beautiful. For the first time since Grandma's death, I felt a spark of excitement about the future. This little cottage would become my sanctuary, my studio, my home. Over the following months, I threw myself into restoring the cottage with the same passion I'd once reserved for my photography. I hired local craftsmen to repair the roof and foundation, but I insisted on doing much of the interior work myself. Each nail I hammered and each wall I painted felt like a conversation with Grandma, as if she were guiding my hand. I discovered treasures hidden throughout the cottage. hand-forged nails in the original construction, a root cellar that would be perfect for storing wine, and most surprisingly, a dark room in the basement that my grandfather had apparently used decades earlier. The restoration became a bridge between my old life and my new one. I documented every step with my camera, creating a visual diary of the cottage's transformation. Some of these photos would later become the foundation for my first gallery exhibition, a series called Reclaiming Home that explored themes of inheritance, belonging, and the courage to create your own definition of family. My relationship with my extended family slowly improved as well. Frank and Martha began stopping by to check on my progress, and I could see their grudging respect for what I was accomplishing. Linda even brought her children to see the cottage, and I watched them explore the creek and climb the oak trees just as I had done decades earlier. The cottage became more than just a home. It became a symbol of possibility. I converted one room into a photography studio and another into a guest room for the friends who began visiting from the city. The kitchen, with its restored farmhouse sink and vintage stove, became the heart of the home where I learned to can peaches just as Grandma had taught me. A year after finding Grandma's letter, I hosted my first Thanksgiving dinner at the cottage. The guest list was small: Martha and Frank, Linda and her family, and a few close friends from the city who'd become like chosen family to me. As I watched everyone gathered around the old wooden table I'd refinished, I felt Grandma's presence as strongly as if she were sitting in the empty chair I'd left at the head of the table. After dinner, Frank pulled me aside on the front porch. "I owe you an apology, Sarah," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We were wrong about the will, and we were wrong about you. Grandma knew exactly what she was doing." I squeezed his hand, understanding that this was his way of welcoming me back into the family fold. She always was the wisest one among us. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, I found myself alone in the cottage for the first time in months. I sat in the rocking chair I'd moved from Grandma's sewing room, now positioned by the cottage's front window, and opened the photo album she'd kept of my work. Looking through those images, I realized that Grandma had seen something in me that I'd only just begun to understand myself. I wasn't the black sheep who'd abandoned the family. I was the bridge between past and future, the one who would carry forward our stories in new ways. The cottage had given me more than just a home. It had given me a sense of purpose, a connection to my roots, and the confidence to create my own definition of belonging. Sometimes the most precious inheritances aren't the ones written in wills. They're the ones written in love. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. It's been incredible to share this journey with you, and I hope it reminds you that sometimes the most meaningful gifts come in unexpected packages. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if you have any stories about unexpected family discoveries or inheritances that changed your life. Your stories inspire me to keep sharing mine. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more real-life tales of family, love, and the surprising ways life can unfold. Until next time, remember that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you choose to build your future.